but we don't translate the names in our Bibles. So we get these, when people are doing their readings on Sunday morning, they stumble across the names and everyone thinks it's quite funny. But yeah, we don't translate the names, whereas they would have had obvious meaning, most of them, to the original readers and hearers of the Bible. Yeah.
Welcome to Series 3 of the Tyndale House podcast. Tyndale House is an international centre for Bible research and a community of Bible scholars in Cambridge, England. Whether you're a regular listener or are joining us for the first time, we're really pleased to have you with us. And if you've missed previous episodes, you can find those wherever you get your podcasts from. This new series that we're starting today is taking a deep dive into names in the Bible with two members of our Old Testament team, Dr. Caleb Howard and Dr. George Heath-Whyte. So let's start by getting to know Caleb and George a little bit more. First, would you like to introduce yourselves? Tell us who you are, what your role is at Tyndale House. We'll start with you, Caleb.
Okay, so I'm Caleb Howard. I am a research fellow in Old Testament and Ancient Near East. That's the historical context of the Old Testament here at Tyndale House. I lead and manage the Old Testament project at the moment, which is focusing on names, as Tony said. I am an Assyriologist, which means that I study ancient Mesopotamia, and in particular Mesopotamian texts and languages, and also history. I work on names, but I also work on the Assyrian Empire. So if you think Hezekiah and the siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC, it's that empire. So that's my specialism.
I'm George. I am also an Assyriologist, and I'm a research associate in Old Testament and Ancient Near Eastern Studies, and I'm also working on the Names Project. And my specialism is sort of the first half of the first millennium BC, the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. But for the project, I'm working on a period a bit earlier than that, the late second millennium BC, and the kingdom of Ugarit on the Syrian coast.
So we've mentioned the Names Project and the Onomastics Project. What does onomastics mean, and what is the project? What are you trying to do?
Yeah, so onomastics is the study of names, and we're looking specifically at anthroponomastics, so personal names, people's names. We're not looking at place names, we're not looking at animal names, and so on. As Tony said, there are quite a lot of names in the personal names in the Old Testament. And we're focusing on them. And if we think about the Old Testament as running from sort of, the project is focusing on the Old Testament from Abraham to Nehemiah. There's more in the Old Testament than that, but this is what we've chosen to focus on, partly because there's just so much extra biblical material there for those periods. So that would be approximately 2000 BC down to about 400 BC. That's a long time, but we also have a lot of texts from the time and place of the Old Testament between those periods, which we are using to populate a database.
By text from that period, you don't mean biblical text. You mean you're talking about extra biblical other texts.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's all right. So many of these texts are written on cuneiform tablets. So cuneiform is a writing system, especially used to write the main language of Mesopotamia, Akkadian, which is a language related to Hebrew and Aramaic and so on. It's also used to write many other languages, much like the Latin script. Some of the texts that we're looking at are written on ostraca, so little pieces of pottery, and also on other sometimes perishable materials. The aim is to set the biblical names, the names we find in the Old Testament, in the context of the names that we find in the text outside the Bible. So if you think about, the name James or Violet in our time in the West, in Britain or in the US or Canada or somewhere like that, these are common names and we recognize them as such, right? If we hear the name James, we can draw certain conclusions. For example, the person is likely to be a man, because we know the names in our time and place. And it stands to reason that someone like Abraham or someone like David or someone like Nehemiah would have a sense of the onomasticon, the pool of names, the set of names in their own time. One of our goals in the Onomastics Project is to populate the pool of names for the Old Testament period, and then to think about the biblical names in that context.
Wow. And how long is this project going to take?
Well, it's a 10-year project. We're about halfway through, is that right?
About, yeah. 10 terrifying. We're going to move on.
Mm-hmm. Terrifying because there's so little time left.
Yes, yes. It may seem like 5 years is a long time, but it isn't when we're doing this research. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're looking at a couple of particular places where the names are from.
Yeah.
George, do you want to say a little bit about
yeah, well, I suppose we want
places?
to look at names from, as Caleb said, from 2000 BC to 400 BC, but a lot of projects have already done really good work in collecting names from various different sites and time periods. So we're trying, well, at the moment, our main goal is to fill in the gaps in the data where names, we have all these texts that have been published or not, but we don't have a good database of the names from those texts. And most of these texts are very different to the sorts of texts we get in the Bible. They're letters or legal documents or just administrative lists. And so we, at the moment, are focusing on two sites from the second millennium BC, so Alalak and Ugarit. Alalak is in southern Turkey and Ugarit is on the coast of modern-day Syria. And Alalak has texts from sort of early second millennium BC and the late second millennium BC as well. And Ugarit has texts from the late second millennium BC, together sort of a couple of thousand. And by getting the names from these times and places, we are getting close to the period of, well, starting with Abraham, going up through Judges and the conquest, and the conquest and then Judges. And we're not sort of in the state of Israel, but we are in a neighbouring state around the same time, the same place. And Ugarit in particular is a very international place. People are moving from all over the known world at the time, from Egypt, from modern-day Turkey, from all over the place. They're doing trade, they're moving in and out. And so it's a really good place to look at the sorts of names that were, and the sorts of people that were moving around in that time period.
It's all really interesting. How will it help us in understanding names in the Bible better?
Yeah, so a straightforward way that this helps us to understand things is just to see that the names in the Bible fit in their time. So when we find that a name like Abram is fairly common, really across the biblical period, not just in Abraham's own time, right? There's this sense that, well, this works, this makes sense. And when we sort of populate the onomasticon of the time and place of the Old Testament, we can find exact correspondences between the Old Testament names and the extra-biblical names. So there's a kind of, I don't know, on the face of it, correspondence there that sort of helps us to understand what's going on in the Bible historically. It helps us to situate the Bible in its setting. But there are more specific ways in which this helps us. An example would be the development of language change. So all languages change through time. This is clear. So if you've studied Middle English or Old English texts, you will see how English has changed over time. If you're familiar at all with the King James Version of the Bible, you will recognize that King James English is not modern English. Well, Hebrew in the language family, the Semitic languages, change through time. And you can see that going on in common texts, but you can also see it going on in names. Names reflect the change of names through of language through time. And it's possible on that basis, to some degree, to establish a kind of relative chronological order of where we expect names to occur in time across the biblical text on the basis of those names occurring or not, or features, linguistic features in names occurring or not across time outside of the Bible and text outside of the Bible. This is also true to some degree with respect to the kinds of words that we find in names. So names outside of the Bible and inside of the Bible mean things. They're translatable. So they were probably transparent in their meaning to native speakers. And so it's possible over time to see how elements of names, words in names, come in and out of names through time. Many of them are pretty stable across time, but some of them occur in some periods and not in other periods. A good example of this is the divine element, the divine name, Yahweh, which, if you look at the Bible, is very uncommon in names in early periods in the Bible before, say, Judges, and certainly in 1 and 2 Samuel and following.
Right.
So we have Yocheved, which has the Yahwistic name, the name Yahweh in it. This is Aaron and Moses' mother. And then we have Joshua, Yehoshua, whose name has the name Yahweh in it. But those are the only two in that early period.
Really?
And increasingly, as time goes, the name Yahweh appears in names more and more as time goes on, so that by the later period of Israelite history, just before the exile and even during the exile, the name Yahweh occurs in people's names very often, very commonly. So you can see how in that case it's a matter of a divine name appearing or not through time.
So you've got, in that later period, then you've got people like Hezekiah, Joshua, Jehoiakim, and these, and all of these are including the divine name.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right.
So Yehoiakin, for example, means Yeho, which is a shortened form of Yahweh. Will establish or has established, depending on how you analyze the verb Yehoiakin. And this is a fairly common reality.
Yeah, great. So we'll hear more about that as we go through the series. We've already picked up on the idea that names have meanings, and the meaning of names seems to be particularly important in the Bible in a way that it doesn't feel like it does to us. And yet, when children are given names, even in our world, we often do think about their meanings. So tell us about your names. Why? What do your names mean?
Well, George is from the Greek word for farmer. There you go. Yeah.
Okay,
There you go.
great.
Yeah. But I think
But you're not a farmer.
one thing that's interesting about my name is that I'm not a farmer, and the meaning of the name I don't think came into the choice of the name.
Right.
But my father was reading a biography of George Whitefield when him and my mum were thinking about names, and apparently decided that sounds like that would be a good name. So not that I'm necessarily named after George Whitefield, but sort of my name was inspired by a figure in history. So that sort of meaning of the name, even though it's not the sort of translatable meaning of the name, was important. But that's my name.
Mm-hmm. Yours is more interesting than mine.
Yours is funnier though.
Yeah. So Caleb means a dog. Of course, it's a biblical name. Or does it mean that?
Ooh.
So given
Trying
the way
to prove that it doesn't.
George, no, it does. It does. But the way that George has just problematized the whole notion of names meaning things. So my parents, I think, gave me the name because of the biblical character. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that in Joshua and other books, Caleb is a faithful person. He's a person who obeys the Lord, trusts God. And I think the idea is that they gave me the name in connection with their sense that I was an admirable sort of person to be. So does the name to them mean dog, or does the name to them mean the character behind the name in the Bible? And then potentially it gets connected to me. Maybe I live up to it, maybe I don't, probably not. But anyway, the idea is that I would. So etymologically, we might say, that is to say, in terms of the original sense of the name, where it comes from linguistically, Caleb comes from the Semitic word meaning dog. It occurs in lots of Semitic languages. And it's not clear to me whether dog was a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe dog is a loyal notion. Maybe dog is, I don't know, a low notion of some kind. Difficult to know.
And we do find lots of people with that name outside the Bible as well, from those sorts of times and places. So obviously, presumably it wasn't an awful thing to be called Caleb, but
maybe. Yeah. So it's worth just thinking about this notion of a name's meaning, right? Sort of its etymological sense, its original sense, we might say, its original linguistic sense, is not necessarily the same thing as the meaning, the associative meaning that it has in the minds of its bearers or bestowers of names. So my name etymologically means Caleb, but there's a connection with a biblical character. It means dog, but there's a connection with a biblical character.
Yeah. Mine apparently means the smallest of a litter of pigs. And I have absolutely no idea why my parents gave me this name. I think it has no particular significance. I think they just liked the sound of it. But I never think about the meaning of it in normal life. It's only in these kind of conversations where it's an even funnier name than dog. At least a dog has connotations of faithfulness. I'm not sure what connotations a runt has, but there we are. I ended up fairly tall, so it wasn't too bad. But in day-to-day life, we may know the meaning of our names, but we don't think about it. Now, obviously, this is speculation, but to what extent do you think that would also be true in the ancient world? Do you think Caleb, for instance, do you think he would have kind of gone through life with that sense of faithfulness, or somebody else with whose name has a very distinctive meaning? Abraham, exalted father. Maybe he was aware of the meaning of his name because it was so ironic for most of his life that he wasn't a father at all. Or do you think people, as in the modern world, it's a label, it's part of our identity, but the meaning it's something in the background?
Yeah, it's difficult. There is this concept called nominative determinism, whereby I'm sort of making it up, but sort of think like people with the surname Judge are statistically more likely to go into the legal profession than people with other surnames, or that sort of thing.
The first marine biologist I ever met was called Jim Dolphin.
There you go, exactly, yeah. So it seems that there is a way that if people do know the meaning of the word, their names, or if their names do have obvious meaning, that maybe somehow it does sort of tend to influence their decisions as they're growing up. But perhaps it'd be interesting to think about how we think of people we know that do have names with obvious meaning in our language, like Hope or Lily or something. My experience, if I think about it, is I'm not often thinking about the meaning of a friend's name, even if it does have a very obvious meaning in the language. For me, when I'm thinking of someone called Hope, I'm thinking of the person and not the meaning of the name. But in certain instances, I might think, oh, that's funny, she's called Hope and she's lost all hope in something, or whatever it is.
And I guess actually, just on the back of that, there are some names that are more likely, I suppose, because the meaning is so very obvious, like Hope. We don't even have to stop and think about it. But a name like Grace or Joy, I think about the meaning of their names more often than I would George the farmer or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's worth just thinking about the fact that in our language, in English, the meanings of names are more readily available to us in common speech than maybe in other languages. And I think this is certainly true for Hebrew in the Bible and in related languages outside of the Bible. We're finding that names regularly have pretty transparent meanings to native speakers in the sources that we're reading, which is quite different from our situation, which means that we have to sort of take a step back and think, well, how would they have been engaging with names a bit differently than we would?
So it would be more like the Hope, Joy, Grace kind of names than the Caleb, George.
Exactly. Right.
But we don't translate the names in our Bibles, so we get these, when people are doing their readings on Sunday morning, they stumble across the names and everyone thinks it's quite funny, but we don't translate the names, whereas they would have had obvious meaning, most of them, to the original readers and hearers of the Bible.
It's clear that when people engage with names, the meanings of which are clear to them, that in their minds, and I think in our minds, we can engage with names like Joy and so on in a purely kind of name sense, label for person sense, and then also in a kind of lexical sense where we're thinking about the meaning of it. We can move back and forth along a spectrum between those two extremes in our minds. And certain situations can flag up the lexical meaning of a name. Right. Joy is a joyful notion. Violet is a flower and also a color and so on. And we can use that. We can activate that aspect of our brains, that aspect of our knowledge of the onomasticon. But equally, we can simply refer to a person who is called Violet, or refer to a person who is called George, even though we know that his name means farmer. Maybe I'll always think of that now. But George is not a farmer, he's an academic, a Syriologist. Yes, but we can move back and forth between these senses, right? Name is a label for a person versus name being a a word in the language. And it seems likely that there was this kind of moving back and forth going on in the ancient world. We find this in the Bible, for example, when children are named and some connection is drawn between the circumstances of birth and the meaning of the name or the sounds of the name. Yeah. And this is, you will recognize this as a common theme, particularly in the book of Genesis, but also to some degree in other books as well.
And we'll talk particularly about that in our next episode. Just going back to the nominative determinism thing, there's and maybe we'll talk about this next episode as well, but let's just briefly look at it now. There is the sense of some people in the Bible having names that are almost prophetic for them, maybe is the best way of putting it. So Caleb, he's called Caleb as a young kid, and did his parents have a connotation of faithfulness there? But he grows up to be a faithful man. Abraham, exalted father. The Lord says your name's going to be Abraham, which is father of many, I think. Okay, that's how it's often said. We'll come back to that. And then eventually he does become a father, but maybe he's a bit of a special case. But there are people who seem to live out their name, and other people who don't. So when we're reading Scripture, should we be always reading with an eye to the meaning of their name, or is it okay just to be thinking of them as labels? How does all of that work?
That's very helpful.
Maybe that's an overcomplicated question.
No, it's very helpful. I think a good guide to this is just whether the text is already making something of the name.
Right.
If that's already a live issue in the text, then I think actually Abraham is a good example. However you analyze that name etymologically, the text does make a connection between Avram, exalted father, and Avraham, father of, well, I think it's still exalted father, but with an added H, which is very interesting. Okay. But it sounds like Hamon, which is this word for multitude, which also occurs in the context. You will be a father of a multitude of peoples, of nations. And so there's a sound connection. So it's important to recognize that the connections made in the Bible between names and circumstances around birth and the person's life and so on are not merely around the meaning of the name, but also around the sounds in connection with other words in the context.
Right.
So this is I think this is a fairly common reality. So you can see it in the case of Samuel, and I think you can see it also in the shift from Avram to Avraham. The etymological meaning between Avram and Avraham, I think they're identical. And in some Semitic languages, we have the addition of an H in a word like this, Raham versus Ram. Ram is this exalted word with the H added, Raham. This doesn't change the meaning of the word etymologically, but it does draw a connection then between the name and another term in the context in which it's explained. And so there's a sound connection. So it's worth thinking, sort of broadening our scope of understanding of the relationship between names and the reasons for which they're given, to include not just etymology or lexemes and meaning, but also sounds. Broadly, correspondence is the order of the day rather than a particular type of correspondence.
Yeah, right. So that's very interesting about Abraham, because that makes me wonder if Avram and Avraham really mean the same thing, and yet the Lord wants him to think of himself as Avraham. Is that hearing of the sound therefore going to more remind him of what the Lord is going to do for him than his original name did? I don't know. I mean, this is complete speculation about what was going on in Abraham's mind a long time ago. But yeah, that's very interesting.
There's a very interesting case in Samuel, whose name means name of God, Shemuel. It means name of God, and in the context of the giving of the name Samuel, there's not so much being made of the name of God. Rather, when Hannah names him, she uses the Hebrew word for ask repeatedly, sha'al. In fact, 5 times in the context of Samuel's naming, sha'al is used to explain the circumstances of Samuel being born, and even to explain the giving of the name. Sha'al, to ask. she says, I asked him from God, and the Lord has given him. And so she's called his name Shemuel, name of God. Now, of course, there are theological connections and etymological connections between name of God and the circumstances of God's work in Samuel's life, naturally. But she makes this connection, and I think on the basis of sound similarity, Sha'al and the forms in which it occurs in 1 Samuel 1 sound similar to Shemuel. They share all of the same sounds.
Apart from the M sound,
the M sound.
Which is quite an introduction into his name.
Yeah, it is. But there's an interesting thing here that the last instance of the word Sha'al, to ask, in 1 Samuel 1, is a passive participle, Sha'ul, which means asked one, one asked for. And she refers to him as one asked for from God. But Sha'ul sounds exactly like Saul, King Saul, who, as we keep reading in 1 Samuel, becomes a major figure in relation to Samuel himself. And so there's this flagging literarily in the text of a major character that will come up. And if you can think about this sort of from the point of view of having never read that story before, that's a sort of latent notion that arises again further along in the story, and you may recognize it if you've read from beginning to end. Or if you've read it already before, you see it and you think, Saul is coming up. And there's this connection already between Samuel and Saul. This is part of the literary brilliance of the biblical text.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, that's a great start to this series, I think. We've got a lot more to talk about. And next time we'll be talking about the giving of names more specifically at birth, why people are given the names they are, what those names mean, maybe some of the changing patterns. So for now, great. Thank you very much.